All right, Rabbi, say good morning, Baruch Hashem, welcome, Zachinu, to have completed Maseches Ksuvos, Baruch Hashem, this morning to have the incredible schos to begin Maseches Nedarim. It's so beautiful to see so many here at the start of Shear, so special and so beautiful. Also, Chaim in the back, no one has to sit so far back. You could feel free, there's plenty of seats up here as well. Not going to take anyone's makom or anyone's space. It's always more exciting when we're all a little bit more tzafuf together. So we'll say, let's begin by thanking the sponsors for this morning Shear, to thank our TALMUD TORAH sponsors for the month of Cheshvan, Yanky and Aliza Statman and Yitzy and Rebecca Statman, for dedicating the Shiurim this month in commemoration of the first yarzheit of Menucha Shaindl Yehudis, Bas Dovid Yosef. To thank Shmuel and Robyn Korobkin for dedicating the Shiurim this month in commemoration of the 25th yarzheit of Rabin's mother, Melanie Solomon. Is that too loud? Thank you. Pessa Mira Bas Chaim Zichron Livracha. To thank our Week of Learning sponsors. Sorry. To thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Avram Zysman, in commemoration of the yarzheit of his grandfather, Avram ben Aharon, Zichron Livracha. To thank Tzvi and Shaindy Shear for dedicating the Shiurim this week in honor of the Kehila. To thank Shmuel and Shira Pepper for dedicating the Shiurim this week in honor of Ari Lerner and all he does for the Shul. To thank our Daf Yomi sponsors, Dovid and Malke Kramer, in honor of the Daf Yomi Shear Chevra, and in honor of all of the Maggid Shiur on completing another Masechta, Hakaros HaTov, to all of the Maggid Shiur for their encouragement to participate in this current Daf Yomi cycle, as well as the encouragement to continue learning Daf HaYomi each and every day. Thank you to all of our sponsors for their incredible generosity and for Baruch Hashem, for the beautiful messages. Also with that, let us begin. Shechianu, v'kiyamanu, v'hegianu, lazman hazeh. To begin a new Masechta, there's always an excitement in the air. When it's a new Daf Yomi Masechta, always an excitement in the air. When Baruch Hashem, we have a new haskala. There's just something beautiful, something tangible that you could feel. And the truth is, we're going to have an incredible, magnificent journey in Maseches Nedarim. I will say, just before we get started with the Masechta, before we jump into the Mishnah, just two quick words of introduction. So you're going to see, first of all, Mir Hashem, the dapim are shorter. That's number one. Right? So we're actually going to have a chance to remain on the same Daf Yomi cycle as the rest of the world. That's number one. Number two, I will say, just point out, one of the interesting changes that we're going to see in Maseches Nedarim is that whereas in most Masechtas, the go-to perush is Rashi, so Nedarim is a little bit different. According to almost everyone, Rashi in Maseches Nedarim is not actually Rashi. It's actually commonly referred to as the Mefarish. It's attributed to, it's machlokas exactly whose perush it is, or a compilation of a number of different perushim. But in Maseches Nedarim, Rashi is not considered to be the go-to Mefarish. Instead, it is the Ran. So the Ran, again, on the left-hand side of the page, so you'll notice, again, is much more loquacious than Rashi. So one of the interesting adjustments we'll have to make in this particular Masechta is we're going to go through that. We're going to be using the Ran, although sometimes we will reference, we'll call it Rashi also, we'll reference Rashi as well, but the Ran is really going to be our go-to. Now, the beautiful part of it is, on one hand, the Ran is much longer. On the other hand, you're going to see the Ran is an extensive perush on Maseches Nedarim. So there's going to be a real opportunity here to have a running perush on the Masechta that really gives us a comprehensive understanding. The difficulty I think we'll run into a little bit is that sometimes you'll see that we're not going to do Ran necessarily again from beginning to end the entire time, so we'll have to jump around a little bit, but Amir Hashem, you'll enjoy it. I will say just one other word of introduction as we come to Maseches Nedarim. So as one could imagine, the topic of our Masechta over here is Nedarim, is a Neder. So I will say just by way of introduction, there's a beautiful idea by the Sfas Emes. And the Ger Rebbe quotes the pasuk in Bamidbar, Perek Vav, pasuk Beis. And the Torah writes as follows: Dabra b'nei Yisrael ve'amarta aleim. Speak to the Jewish people and say to them, Isha kiyafli lindar neder nazir lahazir laHashem. So the topic of conversation over here in Parshas Naso is the nazir. Now, nazir is the paradigmatic example of a neder, right? Of a neder, which we'll loosely translate as vow. So the Sfas Emes makes an interesting observation. How do you translate that pasuk? Again, this is Bamidbar, Perek Vav, pasuk Beis. Dabra b'nei Yisrael v'amarta aleim. Speaks to Jewish people, say to them, Isha, man or woman, kiyafli. How do you translate the word yafli? So ultimately, again, if you look in the art scroll, right, if you look in the Chumash, Yafli is translated as articulate. If a man or a woman will articulate a Nazirite vow, says the Rebbe, says the Sasam, is something so beautiful, that the shoresh of Yafli is Pella, is wondrous. And the Sasema says that the most incredible Pella in this world, the most incredible Pella in life, is the ability to affect change through the spoken word. You see, sometimes we think that the only way to affect change is actionally. Right? The only way I could affect change, the only way I can make change in this world is through my actions. And we think words are just words. Right? Words don't necessarily matter. Words don't necessarily matter. Right? Words don't have the ability to affect change as much. But the greatest pella, sometimes the most incredible thing is the ability to affect change through one word. And I will say, this is true on a halachic level, it's true on a hashkafic level, that sometimes, again, you look at, we'll see examples of this. A person makes a neder. What's a neder? A neder are words. And words, a sentence strung together in a particular way could fundamentally change the trajectory of a person's life, could fundamentally change the trajectory of the lives of those around us. That's a pella. That is a pella. That is something absolutely amazing, overwhelming, and wondrous. And I will say we know this, of course, again, in a hashkafic level as well. Words, what we say to a spouse, how we talk to children, how we interact with friends, the word usages, the word choices we make, the tone we choose to take, fundamentally alters the nature and the fabric of our relationships. Says the Sfas Emes. That's why the Torah Kadosh uses a lashon of Yafli, Pella. It is amazing to see how much change could be affected by the spoken word. So I will say one of the incredible pieces of Musar that we'll have to take with us as we go through Maseches Nedarim is to work on our koach hadibur, or to work on our appreciation of speech, and to recognize that sometimes, we're not careful with how we talk, or we're not careful with when we talk, or we're not careful with what we talk about. And part of the sensitivity, which we will hopefully pick up and glean and bolster and reinforce within ourselves over the course of the journey of this beautiful Masechta, is how meaningful, how purposeful, and how powerful each and every word truly is, and how Mirat Hashem we should be zocheh to live our lives in a way which reflects that. I will say with that akdama, let us begin now. Shechiyanu v'kimanu v'giyanu. I will say you have to, right? You feel it, right? You feel the energy, even at 5. And well, now it's already 6:03. Right? Even at 6:03 in the morning, right? You feel the energy of a brand new Masechta. There's something exciting in there. I will say, let's begin. Kol kinui nedarim ki nedarim. So I will say, interestingly enough, the Mishnah begins with a discussion, as I mentioned before, about Nedarim. So let's just translate the words, then we'll get into the Ran. So kol kinui. So we'll say kinui literally means like a nickname. We're going to see the translation that's often given for kinui is a similar term. So we're going to see that sometimes you could explicitly articulate a neder, and sometimes you could use verbiage that is similar to an explicit articulation of a neder. That's called a kinui. The same way that a nickname, right, is not your actual name, but it's similar to your name. So a kinui neder is an articulation that is similar to an actual neder, but does not have the same exact verbiage as a neder. We'll say, let's take a look. Our first Ran, so exciting. You always remember your first Ran. Right, so let's say, take a look. Beis Amud Aleph, left hand side. So again, I apologize in advance. We're going to be jumping through the Ran a little bit, so you'll follow me along this. So Rashi says, the Ran says over here, Kol kinui nedarim, what's on the left hand side? Neder hu be'echa mishnei inyanim, im nidreyak hekdish, shu makdish leved hakabayis, olam izbeach be'inyan zeh, enu yachol lahakdish en lamashu shalo, v'isura kol adam, o nidre iser. So both say, sha'aser al atzmo dvarim hamutarim. So we're going to see, and this is very important, the Ran. And also I would suggest, by the way, that if you're going to do a little bit of chazara, and by the way, these dapim are short enough that you could spend 7 minutes on chazara and just run through it. If you have a couple of extra minutes, the Ran is a beautiful, and actually it's a pretty easy read if you go through it, because we're not going to get to do everything. So the Ran says like this. Number one, there are two different types of Nedarim. In the world of Nedarim, two types of Nedarim. Number one, what we call Nidrei Hekdish. What is Nidrei Hekdish? Nidrei Hekdish means you make a neder consecrating something to the Beis HaMikdash or to Bedek HaBayis. Again, we'll get into all of this. But neder number one is I make a neder and the power of my vows, I've made something the property of the Beis HaMikdash. Then says the Ran, 3 lines into the Ran, O Nidrei Isser. Second type of neder is what we call Nidrei Isser. What does that mean? She'asr alatzmo dvarim hamutarim. Nidrei Isser means I take something that is permitted and I go ahead and I make a neder not to partake of this particular item. So I make a neder not to eat a loaf of bread, right? Not to go ahead and eat milchiks, whatever it is. It's inherently permitted. I make a neder not to partake of it. Ube'inyan zeh, good. So we'll say, so now skip a little bit. Umesechazu, he be'inyan nidrei iser. So we'll say, so the Ran points out that our point of departure in the world of Nedarim is not with what we call nidrei hekdish. We're not really talking about right now making something the property of the Beis HaMikdash. Rather, we're much more focused on nidrei iser. I'm making a neder to prohibit something to myself. Now, I will say, skip down a little bit. So you see, in the right across on the first line of the Mishnah, actually, where it says kinuye in the Mishnah, v'nidrei iser. You see that line in the Ran? Good. V'nidrei iser heim echad mishlosha drachim. So now says the Ran. So now just the Ran is very organized. Now we have two categories of Nedarim. Right? Category number one, Nidrei Hekdish. Category number two, Nidrei Isser. Good. In the world of Nidrei Isser, so he says Nedarim can manifest themselves in 3 different ways. Nidrei Isser, heim be'echad mishlosha drachim. Ikar haneder. So what we're going to say, Ikar haneder just means a good old-fashioned, completely, explicitly articulated neder. That's number one. Number two, kinuyav, which means a similar term neder, and yados. Yados, Rabbi say, we will see means a partial statement, but a partial statement that is understood enough to go ahead and create a bona fide neder. So now the Ran explains each of these very quickly, I will say. He says, Ikra, I might be the only person who can't get through Daf Beis in Nedarim. Okay, good. So the Gemara says this house is embarrassing already, 607. Okay, good. So the Gemara says this house, Ikra haneder, well, we'll get through it, it's short. Ikra haneder, hu sheyomar davar ze asr alai. So I will say, so Ikra haneder, but it's very important. Ikra haneder, as I say, this loaf of bread is asr to me. They'll say, so again, Nidrei Isser, remember we're leaving aside now Nidrei Hekdish, leaving that aside. So Nidrei Isser, so I say again, this loaf of bread is Asr to me. That's called an Ikar Neder. They'll say, why is it Ikar Neder? Fully explicit, fully articulated, leaves absolutely nothing to the imagination. Skip down a little bit. I'll say, so now in the wide lines, 3rd line into the wide lines of the Ran, right after the period. You see that? Vikinuyav. So I'll say, so now I know that's Ikar Neder. What's a kinui? Vikinuyav. Hushebemakom karban yomar konam. So we'll say an example. Now it's interesting. He's giving the example from Nidrei Hekdish. So we'll say, so if let's say I was making something the property of the Beis HaMikdash, right? Nidrei Hekdish. So what I would say is, this loaf of bread is like a karban to me. That would be like an Nidrei Hekdish. So I'm equating the status of the loaf of bread with a karban. Just like a karban is aser, right, to me, for benefit, so to this loaf of bread. And that would be an explicit net. What's kinui? For example, Shemakom karban hu yomar konam. Konam. I use an equivalent or similar term. So I say, konam alai kikar zu. Right? This kikar should be konam. I don't know, what does konam mean? Right, konam can mean a lot. So there was this, again, we'll get into this, but this is the example of a kinui. So I use a similar or equivalent neder term, but don't explicitly articulate the neder. So that's a kinui. Rabbi say now skip down in the Ran even more. You see Rabbi say all the way towards the end of the Ran, you see where the Ran, v'charamim kecharamim starts? You see that? 3 lines up from that at the end of the line. The yados nedarim, what's a yad? The yados nedarim hu, shemaschil b'miktsas diburo shal neder. So Rabbi say, so a yad is a partial declaration, a partial statement. That's where I begin a neder articulation. Ela she'ino gomer also. But I don't fully articulate it. So the Gemara says, Ve'ino gomer also, Miksas hadibor, noder kalashim hadibor. So we'll say that the power of a yad is that even a partial declaration has the ability to affect a complete neder. So therefore we'll say, pivotal ran. So now what do I get from this ran? Number one, 2 categories of Nedarim. Neder number 1 is what we call Nidrei Hekdish, which we're not really discussing right now. Category number 2, Nidrei Isser. Nidrei Isser, good. Within Nidrei Isser, the truth is we're going to see within Nidrei Hekdish also, 3 different categories. Iker Neder, which means a fully explicitly articulated Neder, right? Number 2, a kinui, a similar or equivalent Neder term, which affects a complete Neder experience. And number 3, Yad, which is a partial declaration. Beautiful. Let's do the Mishnah. Kol kinui nedarim ki nedarim. So we'll say, so therefore, what is the Mishnah telling me? Any kinui, any similar or equivalent neder term has the ability to affect the neder. So we'll say, again, the chiddush over here is, I might have thought that the only way to go ahead and create a real neder is how? Complete, explicit articulation. Kamash malon, no. There's a concept of a kinui, concept of a yad, which again is equivalent or similar or partial declaration. Good. So kol kinui nedarim ki nedarim. So we'll say, therefore, if you make only a similar or equivalent statement of a neder, that has the ability to affect a full neder. Similarly, v'charamim kecharamim, u'shvuas kishvuas, u'nazirus kinazirus. And I will say the same halacha doesn't just apply to neder; it applies to a cherem. And I will say, what's a cherem? What's a cherem? Right? This sounds like Hakaros Nedarim. Right? Right? What's a cherem? Go back to the ran for just a moment, right where we left off, the middle of the ran, in the wide lines. V'charamim kecharamim, kilomar, sha'omer nechasim elu, alav, cherek, cheref, harehu ki'ilu amar nechasim elu, alav, cherem, v'hemashulam. So we're going to see cherem is a lashon of something is usher to me. So again, we'll discuss what each of these actually mean. But normally I would say, this loaf of bread is cherem unto me. Okay, so that will affect an isser. Even if I use a kinui, a similar or equivalent expression, and the Ran gives a similar equivalent, so the similar or equivalent expressions of a cherem are able to affect a cherem. So just like a kinui neder is a neder, a kinui cherem is a cherem. Similarly, you have a shvua, an oath, and I will say we'll get into this as well. If you look at Rashi, the Ran, shvuas kishvuas, kilomar de kinui shvua, hariu kishvua v'chayla. So we'll say ultimately an equivalent term of, so in other words, if you use a similar or equivalent term for a shvua, a kinui shvua also has the ability to affect the shvua. Again, I will say we'll see examples of all this, but this is the principle. Good. Similarly, again, Nazirus. So we'll say Nazirus we're a bit more familiar with. A person goes ahead, you can make a Neder Nazirus, or you can make a Kinui Neder Nazirus. If you use a Kinui, a similar or equivalent term, that affects Nazirus as well. Beautiful. The Mishnah gives a case. Ha'omer lechavero, a person says to his friend, Mudrani mimcha, Mufreshani mimcha, Miruchukani mimcha. Shabbos say, if a person goes over to his friends and he literally uses this lashon, mudrani, I am nedered from you, right? He's using this as a verb. I'm nedered from you. Mudrani mimcha, mufreshani mimcha. I'm separated from you. Mirichukani mimcha. I'm distanced from you. Shani ochalacha, shani talmucha. In other words, Shabbos say, saying those terms by themselves doesn't mean anything. You have to attach that to something. So what the guy is saying is, I'm mudrani from eating your food. I'm mudrani from drinking your drinks. I am separate. I'm mufreshani from your food. I'm mufreshani from your drinks. I'm distanced, meruchukani, from your food or from your drinks. What's the halacha? Aser. So we'll say that is a case of iser. Now, I just want to point out, skip to the end of the Ran. 3 lines up from the bottom. The Ran writes, Omer alechavero mudrani mimcha, b'gimar mefarish tahainu yados. Now we'll say, we're going to see a big problem. What's the problem? See, I will say, remember, the Mishnah is going to be the Gemara's first question, but the Mishnah is describing the concept of kinui. Remember again, what's kinui? What's kinui? Right? Equivalent. Good. Similar or equivalent terms. This is actually an example of a yad. What's a yad? Going back to what's a yad? Partial declaration. Because I will say, if you notice over here, the guy is only saying like a half a statement. I'm mufreshani from your food and drink. What does that mean? What does that mean? That's a yad. So I'm just pointing out, again, and the Gemara is going to jump on this, Here you introduce the Masechta with telling me that a kinui neder is like a neder, and then you give me an example not of a kinui, but of a yad. So again, the Ran already says this. He says, Mefarish b'Gemara dahainu yodos. Good. So good. Fine. So we'll say, so that's the case. That's the example. Let's finish the Mishnah. So what about menuda anilacha? We'll say, what about the lashon of menuda anilacha? Now, what does menuda mean? What is menuda? I'm excommunicated to you. Nidoi. I'm excommunicated. So we'll say, so what is the power of a statement like that? What is that? What is that? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Akiva hayachochech bazeh lahachmir. So literally, you're going to say also an interesting lashon here. I will actually direct you to Rashi, even though as I mentioned in the introduction, this is not Rashi. So if you look, but again, if you look at what's called Rashi, Rabbi Akiva hayachochech, the last lines on the right hand side, havamachachech lahachmir. So Rabbi Akiva will say, chochech literally means like turmoil or struggle. Rabbi Akiva struggled with this, and in other words, what do I do with the lashon of menuda? And he came out l'chumra. The aser nami the inyan nederhu v'lo barurle. So Rabbi Akiva wasn't exactly sure what to do with the lashon of menuda. What exactly is it? And therefore, ultimately, he came out l'chumra, that if you make a lashon of menuda ani lecha, that affects a neder. Now, what is that? Is that a yad? Is that a kinui? Again, we'll get into in the Mishnah. Good. So we'll say, so now again, mazel tov, mazel tov, mazel tov. We finished our first Mishnah in Masechet Nedarim and Amud Aleph. Amud Aleph. Incredible. Now, we'll say, now again, so just hold on, and I apologize, we don't have notebooks today, but in Meretz Hashem, hopefully by tomorrow, we'll have notebooks. I will say, just keep in mind the structure. Two different types of Nedarim, Nidrei Hektish, Nidrei Isser. Again, in Nedarim itself, three different levels of Nedarim. Iker Nedarim, explicit, complete articulation. Kinui Nedarim, similar or equivalent expressions. And Yodos, partial declarations of Nedarim. The Mishnah teaching us that Mishnah seems to be hyper-focused on kinui, that similar or equivalent expressions have the ability to create a full-fledged neder. Beautiful. Good, I will say, Amud Beis. Beautiful, beautiful Gemara. So the Gemara says, I will say, Arkasha, Kol kinui nedarim kinedarim. So I will say, before the Gemara gets into our question, the Gemara says, I don't understand something. The Mishnah, the structure of the Mishnah, right? I will say, this is Maseches Nedarim. As such, as one could imagine, the topic of Maseches Nedarim is Nedarim. Excellent. So we'll say, so off, but yet, what does the Mishnah do? The Mishnah begins by saying, Kol kinui nedarim nedarim. So right, any kinui, right, any partial, any equivalent or similar expression affects a complete neder. And then it says, by the way, what is true by nedarim is also true by charamim, by shvuos, and by nazirus. The Gemara just picks out on something interesting. So, kol kinui nedarim ki nedarim, maishna gabe nazir, delo katani lehu lekulhu, umaishna gabe nedarim, diktani lekulhu. Shabbos says, the Gemara is intrigued by this. Why? Because a similar Mishnah appears in Maseches Nazir. If you look at the Ran, right hand side of us, you look at the Ran, maishna gabe nedarim diktani kulhu, kavomar, bilu Maseches Nazir, lo tana ella, kinuye neziros kineziros. So here's what's very interesting. So in Maseches Nazir, there's virtually the exact same Mishnah, right? The Mishnah says that when it comes to neziros, kinui neziros is like neziros, but in Nazir it doesn't include all of the other categories. Right? It just says a kinui naziros is like naziros, but then it doesn't say, and the same thing applies to nidarim, charamim, and shvuos. So why is it that in Maseches Nedarim, even though our topic over here is even though our topic are nidarim, yet we include all of the other categories where kinui is the equivalent to the ikar, and yet in Maseches Nazir, we only talk about Nazir and don't include all the other categories. It's a stylistic question. It's common for a Mishnah to espouse a principle, and the principle is being espoused in regard to a particular area in halacha. But once we're espousing the principle, we'll also talk about the other areas in halacha where the principle applies. Right? So that's what's happening over here. Kinui nedarim is like a neder, and by the way, it's not just by nedarim; it's also by shvuos, charamim, naziros. That makes sense. Yet in Maseches Nazir, it only articulates the principle by Nazir and doesn't include other categories. Why is that? To which the Gemara says, furthermore, why is it that in Maseches Nazir, when the Mishnah says that a kinui nezirus is like a neder nezirus, and it doesn't include all the other categories where kinui works, and yet why is it over here that by Nedarim, in our Mishnah, the Iker statement is the opening line of the Mishnah. Kinui, kol kinui Nedarim ki Nedarim. Done. That's our topic. Yet the Mishnah goes on to say, by the way, what's true with Nedarim is also true with Charamim, Shavuos, Nezirus. So why here do we go into all the categories, and why in Nazir don't we go into all the categories? Just a simple stylistic question. Very simple. To which the Gemara says, Mishum, the Neder u'Shvua ksiv gabi hadadi. It's very simple, says the Gemara. Neder and Shvua are written together in the Torah. If you look at the Ran says over here, second line on the right-hand side, Neder u'Shvua ksiv gabi hadadi. The Ran writes, Tichsiv ki yidar neder la'Hashem o hishava shvua. So Rabbi say the Torah itself writes about neder and shvua together. Literally translated, if a person will make a neder to Hashem or will make an oath. So neder and shvua are biblically linked. They're biblically intertwined. So therefore again, so mishum de neder shvua ksiv gabi hadadi tani tartim. Say if Rabbi say wherever you're going to talk about neder, right in the Mishnah is also always going to include what? Always going to include what? Shvua. Especially when the halachas are the same. So we'll say it's actually a fascinating Gemara because we're stylistically building up the Mishnah. So what I have over here is like this. What I have, number one, is the topic is Nedarim. So now I've learned halacha number one. Anytime you make a kinui neder, that's like a neder. Fine. But neder and shvua are biblically linked. So now by the same halacha applies to shvua. So because it applies to shvua, we'll also put that in the Mishnah. Therefore, any kinui shvua is like a shvua. So now I understand why shvua is included. Okay, now watch this. The Chayvan, the Tani Tartin, Tani Lakulu. It's interesting. So now the Gemara says, by the way, so once you've already mentioned two, you might as well make it a party, right? In other words, once you've already mentioned two, you might as well include the other, we'll call it verbal mechanisms as well, verbal frameworks as well. So once you already, in other words, we'll say, once you already have Neder and Shvua, you might as well include the other mechanisms as well. So Tani the Kulu, good. So therefore we'll say good. So that's interesting. So that's it. That's the style of the Mishnah. So we'll say, I want to point out, so interestingly enough, Nezirus, even though Nezirus is also a form of a neder, but as we're going to see, you already see from the Mishnah, Nezirus is looked at as its own entity. Because we're going to see Nezirus as more Maseches Nazir, but Nezirus really has its own unique aspect. So therefore, the Mishnah Maseches Nazir, which is Dafka just talking about Nezirus, fine. So there the Mishnah says, a kinui Nezirus is like a neder Nezirus, and done. Here in our Mishnah, we're talking about Nedarim. So once about Nedarim, you're going to bring in Shvua, because they're biblically linked. Once you have Nedarim and Shvua, you might as well bring in the rest of the items as well, about Charamim and Nezirus as well. Beautiful. So says the Gemara, Velisne kinui Shvuos basar Nedarim. So both say, if that's the case, here's the problem. Both say, stylistically, how is the Mishnah set up? The Mishnah says, any kinui Nedarim is like Nedarim. The same halacha applies to Charamim, and Shavuos, and Nezirus. But here's the Shaila. Why don't you change up the order? Shouldn't Shavua come after Nedarim in the Mishnah? Why is Charamim put there in the middle between Neder and Shavua? You know, we're just getting technical just about the style of the Mishnah, right? If the whole reason you're bringing in Shavua is why, because it's mentioned in the pasuk together with Nedarim, so I would have thought that Shavua should be mentioned in the Mishnah right after Nedarim. Number 2. Why is it number 3? To which the Gemara says, it's very interesting. Aidi the Tanabosai, by the way, one of the most important lines in the entire Masechta, and it's only the first day of the Masechta. Aidi the Tana Nedarim the Misarchefza alei, Tana Nami Charamim the Misarchefza alei, Lafuki Shvua the Ka'asar Nafshe Minachef. So, wow. Now let's say, here we go. One of the most important distinctions for the next couple of Masechtas, Rabosai, is the Isser Gavra versus Isser Chefza. So, Rabosai, let's talk about this for just a moment. What is the difference between a neder and a shvua, a vow and an oath? So, Rabosai, here the Gemara explains it. Let's talk about this outside, then we'll get to it inside in just a moment. Rabosai, when a person makes a neder, what they are doing is they are creating an Isser Chefza. An Isser Chefza. I am creating a state of prohibition upon an object. Now, obviously, it's about the relationship between myself and the object. So now, that object is Asr to me. Right? Now, we'll say, so that's called an Isser Chefza. There is a layer of prohibition that devolves upon the object itself. Versus Shvuah. They will say, when you take an oath, what is an oath? An oath, ultimately, again, is an Isser Gavra. Is a prohibition. We spoke about this actually a little bit on Shabbos Shuvah. Right? An oath, right? The Shvuah is an Isser Gavra. It is a prohibition upon me. So we'll say, just to illustrate this very simply, when you take a neder, let's say a person says, right, I'm taking this loaf of bread should be asur upon me. They will say, what is the neder devolved upon? What is the neder devolved upon? The bread. Now obviously it's devolved upon me also, right? But lamaisa, the prohibition of the neder is upon the loaf of bread, which is why, can I get another loaf of bread? Absolutely. Why? Because the prohibition was only on that particular loaf. An Isser Chefza. A Shavua, on the other hand, the will say is, I take a Shavua not to eat bread. What is that Shavua upon? Me. And therefore, which loaves of bread does it apply to? All of them. The will say, underline this, if you're using your own Gemara, right? Underline this, because this is incredibly important. So let's just read this back into the Mishnah for just a moment. So now watch this. Remember again, I will say, follow the flow. We're trying to figure out, why does the Mishnah discuss anything more other than Nedarim? Right? This is Maseches Nedarim. So now I understand. We have to bring in Shavua. Why? Because Shavua is mentioned in the same pasuk as Nedarim. So you're going to speak about Nedarim, speak about Shavua. Fantastic. What about Charamim and Naziris? Well, once you've already mentioned Nedarim, you've already mentioned Shavua, you might as well bring in Charamim and Naziris as well. Okay, but why not mention Shavua right after Nedarim in the Mishnah? To which the Gemara says, here we go. So the Gemara says, Aidi detana Nedarim de Misra Cheftzale. So we'll say, so once we mention Nedarim, a Neder is an Isra Chefza. The prohibition devolves upon the object. Tana Nami Charamim de Misra Cheftzale. Shabbos says we're going to see Cherem is also an Isra Chefza. Cherem also creates a level of prohibition upon the object itself. La'fuke Shvuah de Ka'asr Nafshei Min HaChefza. As opposed to Shvuah, ultimately again, which is an Isser Gavra. Right? Literally the Lashon over here is La'fuke Shvuah de Ka'asr Nafshei. I prohibit myself from the particular items. Therefore, Rabbi say, going back to the Mishnah, so again, therefore we start out with Nedarim, but once you're already in the world of Isser Chefza, we're going to include now what? Charamim, which is also an Isser. And Rabbi say, we don't really know fully what a Cherem is, but now, okay, it's in the orbit of Nedarim, so it's going to be an Isser Chefza. After we finish with the Isser Chefzas, what do we go to? Shvuah, which is an Isser Gavra. Now, Rabbi say, according to this logic, it sounds like, what is Nazirus? Also an Isser Gavra. Again, well, that's the way it sounds like stylistically, but again, we'll get into that. I will say, I'll just mention something incredibly beautiful. I will say, so this, by the way, this chilik of Isser Gavra, Isser Chefza is one of the, first of all, in general, it's one of the most profound chakiras, one of the most profound distinctions you'll find in Shas about Isser Gavra versus Isser Chefza, and also the Iker distinction between a neder and a shvuah. Again, a neder being an Isser Chefza, the prohibition devolves upon the object, versus a shvuah, which is an Isser Gavra. So Rabbi said the Avnei Nezer, the Sakhav Rebbe, has a beautiful, beautiful insight on this, and he says the truth is this applies by derech hashkafa as well. He gives an interesting example between Isser Gavra and Isser Chefza. He says, for example, an Isser Gavra, a good example of this would be, he says, shkatzim v'ramasim, right? Eating non-kosher items, right? Creepy, crawly things, non-kosher animals. That's an Isser Gavra. It's an Isser Gavra. He says, what does it Isser Gavra mean? He says, Isser Gavra are things, I'm better than this. Right? Isser Gavra means that there are things that I should not do because they're beneath me. I'm better than this, right? And maybe once upon a time I did these averos, but I've graduated past, or at least I should graduate past that. So it's a gavra. I'm a gavra. I'm someone who is special. I am someone who is holy. I am someone who is accomplished. I am someone who means something to this world. And there, by definition, there are certain things that are beneath me. There are just certain things that I should not be doing. The Abnei Nezer calls that Isser Gavra. Isser Gavra. So what's Isser Chafza? So he gives an example, by the way, of an Isser Chafza. Isser Chafza would be an example of Zar Sha'achal Kodesh. Let's say you have a non-Kohen who ate Truma. I will say, now what's the chab of a non-Kohen who eats Truma? What's the chab of that? In other words, I'm not ready for that. I'm not ready for that, right? I'm not a Kohen, and therefore I'm not holding on that particular level. So it says that is something amazing. The same way that a person has to know what's beneath them, it's beneath me. A person also has to realize in the quest for spiritual accomplishment, what is not yet within reach. Sometimes the greatest mistakes, it's interesting, sometimes the greatest mistake we make in Ruchnius is becoming a little bit of an overachiever. Now, I feel very awkward saying that because we're all about overachieving. But I will say, a person has to be an overachiever, but you have to be an overachiever for things that are shy. A simple example. If a person says, you know what, the first daf of Maseches Nedarim was so good, I'm giving notice today, right? That's it. I'm going to make my life kula Torah. I will say, do not do it. Do not do it. But 1 second, isn't that the goal? No, that's not your goal, right? Your goal is to go to work. Your goal is to make a living, support your family b'kedusha v'tara with an honest living, right? And ultimately, again, carve out time in your each and every day for beautiful ruchni accomplishment. To quit my job, essentially, again, secede from the natural world and become, seclude myself and closely based on medrash. That's not our tafkid. That might be that might be the tafkid for other people, but that's not our tafkid. Right? That's not. I'm talking about us. I'm talking us, me and you. That's not our job. And if I were to do that, essentially, what I'm doing is I'm overshooting. I'm overreaching. Says the Sasamis. That's called an Isser Chefza. That chefza. That's not yet for me. Maybe one day it will be. Maybe one day. Right now, that's not us. It says that it was such a beautiful insight. It says the Abnei Nezer. There's an Isser Gavra, which in life are the things that are beneath me. I'm better than this. I'm a Gavra, and therefore I should not do these things. And the Isser Chafza, things that are beautiful, but they're not necessarily shayach for me. And life is all about knowing what's an Isser Gavra and what's an Isser Chafza. Back to the Gemara. So ask the Gemara, our kasha, pasach b'kinuyin. So I will say, remember again, I mentioned this in the Mishnah, right? The style of the Mishnah doesn't seem to flow. The Mishnah began with a discussion about kinui. Again, remember, what's a kinui? Right? A kinui, remember again, is similar or equivalent terms. But then the example that the Gemara gave, umefarish yados. The example the Mishnah gave was an example of a yad. What's a yad? Partial declaration. Mufreshani mimcha, meruchukani mimcha, ha'omer lechabeiro, moder ani mimcha. So the Gemara says, "V'su yados kinshi." So the Gemara says, "What happened to yados?" You started with a discussion, ultimately again about kinui, and then you went to yados. What's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, "Ari bahon b'chisrei mechsera." The truth is, there's a piece of the Mishnah that's missing. I both say, the truth is, the Mishnah is really talking about both kinui and yad, both kinuyim and yados. So the Rabbi say, here's the Gemara. Here we go. Bachi katani. Kol kinuyin nedarim kinedarim, v'yados nedarim kinedarim. As I said, now I have it. Now one little line was missing. So how is the Mishnah supposed to read? The Mishnah is supposed to read, any kinui of a neder is like a complete neder. So again, remember again, kinui, similar or equivalent terms. Any similar equivalent term to a neder is like a neder. Similarly again, any yad, any partial declaration of a neder is also like a neder. And then what does the Mishnah do? Then the Mishnah goes into giving an example of a yad. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. The lifrosh kinuyin bereisha. But stylistically, so essentially, here's the style. Style is kinui yad, introduce the kinui yad. This is that missing line. Kinui yad. And then our Mishnah gives an example of what? Of a yad. So says the Gemara, I don't understand. Why don't you follow the flow? If you're first talking about kinui, and then talking about yad, the first example you should give is kinui. So the Gemara says, no, v'lishra commemoration, no. Hahu disalik minei, hahu mefarish bereisha. No, the truth is, there's a different Mishnaic style. The Mishnaic style often says like this, I will say, when you're discussing A and then B, Often the Mishnah will first have the discussion about B before A. Why? Because since I'm in B, right? I'm in B. So therefore I will say in our Mishnah, we spoke about Kinui, then we spoke about Yad, or now we found out we spoke about Yad. So therefore once we're talking about Yad, let's talk about the example of Yad. In other words, once we're already in B, let's just fully talk about that. And the Gemara gives examples. We'll say a whole bunch of examples. And we'll run. We'll say, what are you allowed to light the Shabbos candles with? What can't you light the Shabbos candles with? I will say, and then how does the Mishnah go on? Right? Ein madlikin. So we'll say, again, here you see stylistically. The Mishnah talks about, here are the things you can light with, here are the things you can't light with. Ein madlikin. The first discussion is what? About what you cannot light with. And we'll say, what's the style? The style is A, B, talk about B. Right, you're already in B, talk about B. Another example. We'll say, what can you insulate? Remember, hatmana, which represents, again, the prohibition of insulating on Shabbos, without getting into everything, we're just going to read through these examples, we're not really going to wade into them. What can you insulate with on Shabbos? What can't you insulate? Again, A, B, what can you insulate with? What can't you insulate with? You can't insulate with the following. So you see the structure of the Mishnah, talk about A, talk about B, further discuss B. What could a woman go out with on Shabbos? Shabbos again, Masechah Shabbos, the issue of Hotzah. What are we concerned about? That a woman's may come to carry in Rosh Hashanah. So what could a woman go out with? What can't she go out with? Lo seisei isha. A woman should not go out with. Shabbos, the Gemara is making an argument that Mishnagli, the structure of the Mishnah is that whenever you have a Mishnah talking about multiple things, A and B, often what will happen is when we get into the world of examples or further explanation, we'll first begin to explain B and then go back to A. Since we were already in B, we'll just continue that train of thought and then go back to A. So therefore, we'll say, based on this, our Mishnah reads as follows. Our Mishnah introduces us to Nedarim with what? With a kinui. But now I know Chisrei Mechsra, there was a piece of the Mishnah saying, what did the Mishnah teach me? That kol kinui Nedarim kinedarim. Any kinui of a neder is like a neder. Then what was the second line of the Mishnah? And any yad of a neder is like a yad. And then, by the way, once we get now into the examples, we give an example of a yad before we go into kinuyim. Beautiful. So the Gemara says, 1 second. Is that true, by the way? Is that always the style? That wherever the Mishnah begins with a discussion of A and B, we first give the examples of B before we go back to A. I'll give you other examples. Vatnan. Both listen to this. Yesh nochalin umanchilin. Lo nochalin below manchilin. There are some people who inherit and bequeath, and other people who inherit and don't bequeath. Ve'elu nochalin umanchilin. And these are the people who inherit and bequeath. So both sides. What's the structure over here? A, B, go back and first explain A. Similarly, yesh mutaros lebalein v'asuros liyivmehen. And Rabbi say some people get a little bit of a twitch whenever we go back to Yavamis, right? So again, yesh mutaros lebalein v'asuros liyivmehen. There are some women who are mutter to their husband, but also to the Yavam. Mutaros liyivmehen v'asuros lebalein. Mutter to the Yavam and also to the husband. Ve'elu mutaros lebalein v'asuros liyivmehen. And then when the Mishnah goes into the list, and these women who are permitted to their husbands and also to the Yavam. Once again, A, B, go back and explain A before B. Another one. Yesh tu'unos shemen u'levona. So there are some, let's say, some carbon minchas which require shemen and levona, oil and frankincense. So shemen below levona. Others require shemen and not levona. The elu tu'unos shemen levona, and these are the ones which require shemen levona. So again, it's like I said, we're not wading into the substance of these examples, but just showing you. The Gemara is just saying it's not true. You brought me a whole bunch of examples, 5 examples of a model of what we'll call ABA, which means introduced to A, introduced to B. ABB. Right, that was the first model. Introduced to A, introduced to B, and then continue discussion about B. The Gemara says, I'm just going to bring a whole bunch of examples of ABA, where I talk about A, talk about B, and then go back and give the examples of A. Another example, Yesh tu'unos hagasha ve'ein tu'unos tenufa. On both sides, there are some. This once again is karban mincha. There are some karban minchas, some menachos, that require Hagasha. We'll say the Ran, by the way, 3 lines up from the bottom over here. Tunos Hagasha. Shiyagish HaKoines HaMincha B'Keren Dromis Ma'araves. We'll say there are some Karban Minchas which require being brought to the southwest corner of the Mizbeach. That's called Hagasha. But they do not require Tenufa. They do not require waving. However, there are some that have to be brought to the southwest corner of the Mizbeach but don't require waving. Tenufa v'lo agasha. Some that require waving but don't require being brought to the southwest corner. The elu teunos hagasha. Here are the ones who require being brought to the southwest corner. Once again, right? Introduced to A, introduced to B. Give the examples about A. Another also Gemara is piling this on. There are some examples of a person who could be a bechar, a firstborn for inheritance purposes, but is not a firstborn for pidyon haben purposes. Bechor lekohen, ve'im bechor lenachala, or a person who is a bechar for pidyon haben, but not a bechar ultimately again for inheritance. So we'll say A, B, and now what happens? The Eza bechor lenachala, the Ezu bechor lenachala, ve'im bechor lekohen. What's an example of someone who's a bechar for inheritance, not a bechar for pidyon haben? So we'll say, so again, what do you see over here? So just to kind of hold cup on this. So remember again, what were we bothered by? We were bothered by why the Mishnah is talking about kinuyim, right? Very quickly, about kinuyim, but then gives an example about a yad. So we answered that up. How do we answer that out? Chisur mechsera. There's a line missing from the Mishnah. The Mishnah actually reads, kinui neder is like a neder, and yad neder is like a neder as well. Beautiful. And therefore, again, what does the Mishnah do? The Mishnah gives the example of a yad. Why? The Gemara posits, because the way Mishnayos are set up is when you're talking about A and B, after we speak about B, once we're already in B, we'll give the examples of B. And the Gemara brings a whole bunch of rayas to that. Now, we'll say the problem is the Gemara brings a whole bunch of rayas the other way. Many Mishnayos that are set up in what we'll call an A-B-A model. Talking about A, right? Introduce me to A, introduce me to B, and then give me the examples of A before you go back to B. So what's going on? To which the Gemara says, you're right. To which the Gemara says, Halein mishum da'av shulei mefaresh. The Gemara says mefaresh hahu de pasach bereisha. So we'll say if you take a look, the Gemara explains as follows. The Gemara says you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. In this, the issue over here is halein mishum da'av shulei mefaresh hahu de pasach bereisha. So the Gemara says in this any situation where there are many cases, that's what it means. Halein mishum da'av shulei mefaresh bereisha. In any situation where there are many examples, that's ultimately, again, what we will put at the forefront. In other words, whichever case, or whichever situation has more cases associated with it, that's what we'll start with. So the Gemara says, I baha, b'meh behema yotze, u'ma'ena yotze, delo avsha, v'katani yotze gamal. I will say, what about the cases as follows? What about where the Gemara talks about, this is what an animal could go out with, this is what an animal can't go out with, where you don't have many cases, and yet, again, you begin with Yotze Gamal, the case of A first. So in other words, the Gemara wanted to suggest that ultimately, again, when do you follow an A-B-A model? When A has a lot of cases. When A has a lot of cases, the Gemara just says, but in this Mishnah and Shabbos, where again, Behema Yotzema, what does an animal go out with, what doesn't an animal go out with? Where there aren't a lot of cases, and yet we'll still state A to begin with. To which Rabbi say the Gemara says top of Gimel, Ela lav dafka. But here's the answer. The Gemara says, you're right. You're right. Zimnin de mefareshu de pasach bereisha, v'zimnin hahu de salik mefaresh bereisha. Rabbi say the Gemara says, you're right. It's just there are two models. Sometimes the Gemara will use one model. Sometimes the Gemara, I shouldn't say the Gemara, the Mishnah. Sometimes the Mishnah will use an A-B-B model. Sometimes the Mishnah will use an A-B-A model. And that's it, right? Zimni mefarisha de pasa bereisha, zimno de savra. Now, what's interesting about this is, according to this approach in the Gemara, it doesn't necessarily sound like that there is a rhyme or reason. Just stylistically, sometimes the Mishnah will go one way, sometimes the Mishnah will go a different way. Now, could there be a reason in each particular Mishnah? Absolutely. But the point that the Gemara is making is, there isn't necessarily, in other words, both are valid models. So that's why, again, B'haraya, you'll find both models in different places. I will say just quickly, let's finish up. The other possibility is, Yodos, we'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up with this Ibai Seyam Amir Hashem tomorrow. I will say, I just want to end up just one last. If you notice, by the way, a very solid first Amid of the Gemara. I will say, literally, 7 minutes of Chazara, you could go through this entire Amid. 7 minutes. I know most of us start each new Masechta with the promise of Chazara. It lasts about a day and a half, right? And then just the Daf Yomi train. It's like a bullet train, right? And I can't. And I will say again, don't worry about tomorrow. Right now, you can Chazar this Daf in 7 minutes. I will say, even if I'm just Kona Maseches Nedarim Daf Beis, that's an incredible accomplishment. I will say, Mazel Tov, such a schus to begin this Masechta with you. Mazel Tov, an exciting journey ahead. Shkoyach.